Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to do a brief overview of the code that I've written and explain a little bit about it, the HTML as well as the cascading style sheet. And then I'm going to move forward and we're going to talk about margins and padding and how to create basic navigation elements inside of HTML, styling it with cascading style sheets. Okay, so let's go to our source code, and here we have the body, the wrapper, the header, the nav bar, and the content. In this green part here is the body, this white box is the header, the nav bar is this black part, and then the content is these three paragraphs of text. Text 1, text 2, and text 3. If we go over to our style sheet, we will see that we have our body styled like this. We have a 0 margins, 0 padding. We've set the font family for the entire document, which we can change later, but this will be the main font for the document. And we've given it a background, this nice green color. We've set our paragraphs margins and padding to 0 to take care of any spacing issues that might happen between browsers. And then we have our wrapper, which we have styled. We've given it a width of 800 pixels and a height of 800 pixels, and that is this square right here. We have given it a background color that is this gray color, and we have set the margins to 0 and auto. And what that does is center this wrapper in the middle of the page. So no matter how wide the person's window is of their browser, this will always sit in the middle. And then we've given it a padding of 0 as well. The header is pretty simple. We've given it a height of 78 pixels, and since we haven't set a width, it's going to take up the entire width of its container. And right now the header is contained inside the wrapper, so it's going to have a width of 800 even though we haven't specified it. And we've given it a white background here. Then we move on to our nav bar. We have a display of block, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We have specifically given it a width of 800 and a height of 30 pixels, and then a black background. So that should pretty much explain where we are and catch us up to where we want to be to continue forward. So let's go back here and look, we have a content div, but we have no styling on it yet. And that's fine, because actually I don't want to style the content right now. I want to style the paragraphs that are inside of the content div. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about floating an element in cascading style sheet. And we're also going to talk about the margin and the padding of an element. So let's go over here to our cascading style sheet. And since we don't want to style the content div itself, we want to style the paragraphs inside. We're going to have a space, and then we're going to use the name of the element that we want to style, which is the P for paragraph tag. Okay. Now we go down here to our size attribute. And the first thing we want to do is we want to say display block. Now, as you can see, before this takes effect, each one of these text is inside of this larger block, which is the content div tag. But there is no real border around each one. When I click on this side, it's going to activate this code that I just wrote. So now you can see that each one is contained inside of its own box. And that is done by the display block tag. Basically, a browser and cascading style sheets treat some elements as blocks, a block element, which means it has a defined border, and some things are defined as being in line, which means they flow from one thing to the other. Paragraphs normally are in line because you will have one paragraph and then another paragraph right underneath it, and then perhaps a third paragraph. They all just kind of flow together. But we are specifically telling the browser that we want this paragraph to be a block element. And notice that we only had to write that in one spot, and it styled all three of these paragraphs, because we are styling every single paragraph that is inside of the content div. So that style applies to this one, and this one. Okay, so now that these paragraphs have actual dimensions, we can set what those dimensions are. So we want the height to be 200 pixels, and we'll click over here to activate that. And you see that automatically each one of those paragraphs is now 200 pixels high. And now we want a width of 200 pixels as well. And now each one of these is a little square. So using the display block, the height, and the width, you can change the size of different elements. Now up here, when we had the wrapper div or the header div, we did not have to say display block, because CSS and the browsers automatically interpret div tags as a block element. So we do not have to specify that for a div tag. Okay, well, let's say that we wanted our 3 paragraphs, instead of being vertical, we wanted them to be horizontal. To do that, we need to float them. So we're going to go up here to our position attributes, and I'm going to say float left. Put my semicolon in to close off my line. And now when I click, text 1 stays where it is, but text 2, instead of coming underneath it, floats to the left, and text 3 floats to the left of that. So we have taken our vertical orientation and turned it into a horizontal orientation. So now we are going to talk about margins and padding. And both of them refer to the same thing, just in different places in the block, because we have made these a block element. So a block element not only has a height and a width, it also has a margin and a padding element to it. So we are going to come down here to formatting, and I'm going to set the margin to 10 pixels. And what that's going to do when I click here is it's going to create a buffer zone on the outside of the block around each one of these paragraphs of 10 pixels. That means that there's 10 pixels here on this side of this text block. There is 10 pixels here on the right side of this one, and also 10 pixels here on the left side of this one. So there's a total of 20 pixels across here. There's also a total of 20 in between these two, and then you can't see it, but there's 10 on this side. So when you're setting the margin of an item, you are setting the space around the outside of the block. So now let's do padding, and we'll do 10 pixels there as well. Now you see, with padding, we have added 10 pixels to the inside of each of these text blocks, like that. So margin is the space on the outside, padding is the space on the inside of the block. Now let me take this away, and I want you to notice what happens to the width of this entire line. We have the edge of this text block is here, and when I add this back in, let me do it this way. There we go. Now I'm going to click, and I want you to watch the right edge of this block. You'll see that each one of these blocks got dramatically bigger, and instead of the edge being here, the edge is now all the way over here. And that is because when you're adding padding, the cascading style sheet in the browser keeps the width and the height at 200 pixels, and it adds the padding to this measurement. So the width of each one of these blocks is now 220, because we have 10 pixels here of padding, we have 200 pixels for the width, and we have 10 more pixels for the padding on the other side. And the same goes for the height. 10 pixels, 200 pixels, 10 pixels. So now we have made these blocks 220 pixels wide and 220 pixels high. And that's very important to remember as you are working with measuring things out across the screen, that when you add margins and you add padding, you are not changing the width and the height. You are adding to the width and the height of the item. So that if we wanted the width, we wanted these blocks to stay within that same spot, within that same place, we would need to reduce the width and the height by 20 pixels. And we would make them 180. So now we see that our boxes are back to where they used to be, but we also have the margin and the padding added. So that's how that works with taking elements like a paragraph on the page and then manipulating them to do other things with them. And so now what I want to do is we are going to take those principles that we learned here, and we are going to create a navigation bar that is going to go across inside of our navigation area here. So let's save our work, and we're going to go back here, and here we have our nav bar element. In order to do a navigation bar, the easiest way to do it is to create an unordered list. And actually what I'm going to do to make this a little clearer is I'm going to create the unordered list here first, so that you will see what it looks like here, and then I will move it up into the nav bar. So UL in HTML stands for unordered list, and we want to close that tag. And then each item in that unordered list is called a list item, or LI for list item. And the first button we're going to have is going to be called Home. And the second is going to be called About Us. And the third one is going to be called Products. And we'll put a fourth one in here, and it will be Contact Us. Pretty standard types of buttons that you would see on a website. Okay, so now if I click over here, you will see that we have our traditional unordered list in HTML. We have our dots, our bullet points, and we have our list out beside that. Now the reason it looks funky is because these are floated, and so that is pushing this unordered list up to overlap these, but don't worry about that right now. I basically just wanted you to see what this looks like without any styling on it, with the bullet points. So now let's move this up into our nav bar. So, and that's why I did that, because this is going to be hard to see for a while until we style this correctly. Because now it's pushing down past the nav bar and being hidden by it. But now we have our HTML in place. Let's start to style this. And we have a section here specifically for navigation. So let's put all of this styles underneath this heading so we remember where it all is. So let's start a new styling tag, and let's put in our reminders here so we can keep our sanity. Okay, but we don't want to style the nav bar because we already have the nav bar styled here. We want to style the unordered list first, and we will also want to style the list items inside of that unordered list. Okay, so now the first thing we want to do is add to our HTML. Because if these are going to be navigation, they also need to be links. So we create a link with an anchor tag. And this shows up in green, and this is your basic anchor tag. A stands for anchor, and href stands for the hyperlink reference that we want this to go to when we click on it. But for right now, we really don't have a place for it to go because we haven't gotten that far yet. So we will place a pound sign inside of these two double quotation marks. And that will basically tell the browser, when you click on this, treat it like a link, but it's not going to go anywhere on the page. And we will copy these like this, so we just don't have to retype the whole thing. And we've got to retype that. Okay, so now we see that not only do we have an unordered list, but we have an unordered list of links. And that means that we can change or add to our cascading style sheet. And we will also be styling the links inside of this unordered list, or inside of this nav bar. So the first thing we want to do, so this is easier to see, is change the color of the links. And since it's a black background, we're going to change them to white. And the next thing we want to do is to remove the underline underneath the links. And that is done with text decoration, and we are going to set it to none. We don't want any additional things done to the text visually. And now you will see we have white text with no underline, even though they are still links. And we'll fix the, later on we will go back and make it obvious that these are links. So now we want to go to the list items and start to style that. And the first thing we want to do is go display block, just like we did with the paragraphs. And now you see that each one of these is its own item, its own block, with a height and a width. And we want to say, give these all a width of, let's say, 150 pixels. Let's see how that works. Okay. And just like we did with the paragraph tags, we want to float them left. So now you can see that we are actually starting to get something like a nav bar going on here. But they're kind of positioned kind of low. And that is probably because the UL, or the unordered list portion, has its own padding and margins interfering. So let's go to formatting, and we want to set the padding to 0 and the margins to 0 as well. And now you see that even though there was nothing that was specified, the browser, or Dreamweaver in this case, was automatically putting in a value for the padding and the margin. So we specifically had to set those to 0. Now we will start to mess with those a little bit in order to get these to line up. But for right now, they're inside of the nav bar. And now we need to get rid of these little bullet points. So we will go to List, Style, None. And now our bullet points have disappeared. So we are slowly transforming this unordered list into an actual navigation. Now these look kind of weird because they're all crammed up here against the side, and they don't really space themselves out very well here across the bar. But we can change that by using our margins and padding of the actual list element itself. And usually this takes a little bit of experimenting to get it right, and that's just fine. So let's go and let's try first of all some margin, and let's say 10 pixels. Okay, that's looking pretty good. It pushed it down a little far. So let's try 5 pixels. Okay. So now we have a much better spacing on our navigation items. But I have it right here on the top and the bottom, but it's still not spaced out very well across the bar. So I want to actually specify different margin for the left and the right than I do from the top and the bottom. So a universal margin of 5 pixels isn't going to work for me. What I want to do is go margin, top, 5 pixels. So that's going to keep this spacing, and I'm then going to go margin left, and let's make that 15 pixels. Now you see that I can actually start to change each individual side's margins to help me space these out evenly. Let's go 25. Much better. So the next thing I want to do is I want to preview this in a browser. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to say preview in Safari. Save changes, yes. So Safari is going to launch. Let me bring this down here. And so here we have our nav bar, and we have our 4 links in it, and we have our 3 paragraphs all behaving nicely in a line. But the last thing I want to show you is the fact that I know that these are links because my little icon changes to a hand when I go over them. But other than that, there's no way for me to really know that that's something I should click on. So the last part of cascading style sheets that I'm going to talk about is called a pseudo class. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to add a pseudo class to this anchor tag that we're styling. And we're going to call this pseudo class, the pseudo class that we're going to use specifically is going to refer to what happens to that anchor tag when the cursor hovers over top of it. So now we can change the color. Whoops. There we go. We can change the color of the text when you hover over top of it. And let's make it a green color. So now if we preview this in the browser, let's reload our page. Now when we hover over it, it automatically turns green. And the only thing we had to use to do that is to use a colon and the word hover. And there's several other pseudo classes that you can use. One is called visited, so that a link will change color if someone has been there before. And there's a few others that you use. I always use just hover. You can also use a pseudo class, I believe, of click, so that it will actually change colors when the person clicks it. But for our purposes, we're just going to stick with hover and leave it there. So you can see that we didn't really change very much from that original HTML that we started with. The only thing I really added was an unordered list. But we were able to drastically change the way the page looks with just a few lines of cascading style sheet. We talked about the display block tag. We talked about the width and the height tags. We talked about the margin and padding. We talked about how sometimes you have to set them to 0 to start from scratch. And that you can also change the margin and padding individually for different sections of the block, the top or the left. Because we can also have padding left, we'll just set these to 0. Padding right, just like you can do with the margin. So you can individually manipulate the spacing of your different items on your page. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you learned a lot. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.